Imagine waking up and realizing, for the very first time in human history, that your suffering isn't actually God's plan.
Right, that it's not some divine decree.
Exactly. That the poverty in your streets or, the diseases wiping out your town and even the tyrannical king taxing you into starvation,
Yeah.
that none of these are divine punishments you just have to endure.
Which is a huge mental leap.
It really is.
Yeah.
Imagine waking up to the radical idea that all of these things are simply, well, engineering problems.
Yeah.
And more importantly, that you actually have the tools to fix them. So today we are opening up the ultimate blueprint of how 18th century thinkers tried to hack human civilization.
I mean, it is arguably the most profound psychological shift in the history of the West.
Oh, for sure.
That realization that humanity could actually take the wheel of its own destiny, it changed literally everything about how we live today.
And we are jumping right into those muddy, fascinating waters today. We're opening a truly monumental piece of scholarship. It's Peter Gay's masterpiece, The Enlightenment, an interpretation volume 2, The Science of Freedom.
Published in 1969, right?
Yep, 1969. Now, for you listening, if you're familiar with Volume I of Gay's work, you know it covered the intellectual rebellion.
The teardown phase, basically.
Right, the teardown. It showed how the philosophes, these brilliant, radical French, British, and German thinkers, how they used classical pagan thought to break free from their rigid Christian education.
Yeah, Volume I was really the demolition of the old intellectual order.
Exactly. But Volume 2, which is our entire focus for this deep dive today, shifts gears from the rebellion to the reality.
It's the construction site.
Yes, this is about their environment. The economic shifts, the cultural tectonic plates moving, and the actual concrete program these thinkers built to pursue modernity, progress, and science.
It is the social history of their philosophy, the literal blueprint they drew up for a new world.
Now, a quick but really crucial note for you listening before we dive in. The source material we're covering today heavily discusses the philosophers' intense critiques of Christianity, the church, and, traditional political hierarchies.
They were not shy about their opinion.
Not at all. So, as always, our mission in this deep dive is to impartially report on these historical viewpoints. We just want to help you understand the original source material.
Right, we're simply mapping out their minds.
Exactly. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing the religious or political views of these 18th century thinkers.
Yeah.
We just want to understand their historical context.
It's a vital framework to keep in mind. Our goal is strictly the comprehension of their historical worldview.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even begin to understand the specific ideas of the Enlightenment, we have to understand the vibe of the 18th century.
The emotional baseline, yeah.
Right, because if you read these texts, there is this sudden, almost intoxicating wave of optimism. Where did that come from?
That is the necessary starting point. Because you really cannot understand the philosophy without understanding the emotional and psychological foundation it rested upon.
Makes sense.
And Peter Gay gives this foundation a magnificent, really evocative name. He calls it the recovery of nerve.
The recovery of nerve. I love that.
It's perfect. But to truly grasp how revolutionary this recovery was, we have to look backward at the centuries that preceded it.
Right. Set the stage.
For the longest time, ancient and medieval thought was completely dominated by this profound historical fatalism.
Okay, so when you say fatalism, you mean the idea that history is just happening to us rather than us actually making history.
Yes, exactly. History was generally viewed through two incredibly disempowering lenses.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first was the idea of continuous decline.
Like things are just getting worse.
Basically, yeah. The belief that humanity started in some mythical, perfect golden age or, biblical Garden of Eden. And every single generation since has just been a degraded, corrupted shadow of that past glory.
Oh, wow. So the best days were fundamentally behind us.
Always behind us. And the second lens was the concept of Fortuna, the fickle Roman goddess of chance.
Right, the wheel of fortune.
Yeah, life was seen as a playground dictated by her whims. You might be a king today and a beggar tomorrow, and there was just no rational pattern to it at all.
That's terrifying, honestly.
It really is. Even brilliant minds of the Renaissance, like Machiavelli, they believed that at best, through sheer ruthless energy, a great man might wrest control of maybe half his destiny from Fortuna.
Wow, only half.
Yeah, only half. And the other half, that belonged entirely to blind chance.
So humanity is basically just strapped to this giant wheel of fortune. Sometimes you're up, sometimes you're down, but you definitely aren't the one spinning the wheel. You're just holding on for dear life.
That was the prevailing psychological weather for centuries, but the 18th century sees a complete shattering of this historical fatalism.
And that's the recovery of nerve.
Exactly. Educated Europeans awoke to this expansive, thrilling sense of power over nature and over themselves.
It's kind of wild.
It is. It's telling that the word innovation, which for centuries had been used by traditionalists as a term of abuse it was a synonym for dangerous heresy.
Wait, really? Innovation was a bad word.
Oh, yeah, you're an innovator meant you're trying to destroy tradition. But suddenly in the 18th century, it became a word of highest praise.
That is a massive shift. And the text points to a couple of major intellectual pioneers who set the stage for this, specifically Francis Bacon and René Descartes.
Yes, the heavy hitters.
Right. Bacon goes back and revives this almost forgotten Roman saying, Faber suae quisque fortunae, which basically translates to, man is the architect of his fortune.
A total rejection of fortuna.
Completely. And then Descartes envisions a practical science that would make men masters and possessors of nature.
But what's crucial here is that Bacon and Descartes weren't just writing utopian fantasy.
Right. It wasn't just theory.
Exactly. They were articulating a shift that was beginning to materialize in the real world. This recovery of nerve wasn't just some philosophical mood swing. It was fueled by tangible, undeniable progress.
Progress that people could literally see with their own eyes.
Yes, tangible proof.
Yeah, the statistics in Gay's book are just wild.
Oh.
We're talking about the agricultural revolution, where crop yields are suddenly skyrocketing, finally ending those cyclical famines that had plagued Europe for millennia.
People are actually getting enough to eat.
Right. And we're seeing the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution with things like James Watt's steam engine.
The machine age is dawning.
And the explosion of patents in England alone is a perfect metric for this. The source notes that patents went from about 60 per decade early on to a staggering 325 per decade between 1760 and 1790.
Which is a huge jump.
It is. People are inventing things constantly.
That technological explosion was felt everywhere, in the streets, in the textile workshops, and in the coffee houses where these thinkers gathered.
The atmosphere must have been electric.
It was. But as Peter Gay points out, the most highly visible and heartening index of general improvement, the real engine driving this recovery of nerve, was medicine.
Okay, that makes total sense. Yeah. I mean, if you want to prove to someone that the world is getting better, show them that they're less likely to die an agonizing death than their parents were.
Exactly the point. Medicine was the arena where the philosophers tested their philosophy by actual experience.
It was the proving ground.
Right. It proved to the 18th century mind that human intelligence, when systematically applied, could push back the dark.
Well, the numbers regarding medicine in the source material literally stopped me in my tracks.
The hospital stats.
Yes. Take the British lying-in hospital. In the decade from 1749 to 1759, the death rate for mothers during childbirth was 26.7 per thousand.
Which is just horrifying.
It's so high. But by 1799, just a few decades later, that had plummeted to 2.4 per thousand.
That is an unbelievable drop.
It isn't just a statistical anomaly. That is a massive visible change in human survival. Entire families are no longer being destroyed by the routine act of reproduction.
And at the same time, epidemics like smallpox were noticeably declining.
Right, because of early inoculation efforts.
Exactly. And this was happening because physicians like Dr. Thomas Sydenham and Hermann Boerhaave were aggressively moving medicine away from medieval alchemy.
Away from, like, astrology and bloodletting based on the stars.
Right. They were moving it away from blind tradition and toward strict empirical science based on actual clinical observation.
Look at what actually works.
Exactly. As Descartes had argued a century earlier, the preservation of health is the first of all goods.
Because you can't think if you're dying.
Precisely. The mind depends so much on the temper of the body. If you can use science to cure the physical body, the philosophies reasoned, you can begin to think about curing the mind.
And by extension, you can cure society.
That was the logical leap they made.
I really look at this pre-Enlightenment mindset like living in survival mode in a video game.
Oh, I like that analogy.
Yeah, you spawn in, you have zero resources, the elements are incredibly hostile, disease is everywhere, and you're just hoping the environment doesn't kill you before you can build a little dirt hut.
You are entirely reactive.
Exactly. But the 18th century, with all these medical and technological breakthroughs, is when humanity finally unlocked builder mode.
You have real tools now.
Yes. You can manipulate the environment. You can actually design your surroundings instead of just hiding from them.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the recovery of nerve. They realized they had the tools to build, and they felt an overwhelming imperative to actually use them.
But I do have to push back here for a second because the source material makes it very clear that the 18th century was still a brutal place to live for the vast majority of people.
Oh, absolutely. It was incredibly harsh.
Right, so this builder mode wasn't really unlocked for everyone, was it?
Yeah.
How did these hyper-optimistic philosophers justify the massive slums in London or Paris?
That's the tension.
Yeah, like the displaced agricultural workers, the urban poor who were literally drowning their sorrows in cheap gin. Wasn't this progress incredibly uneven and frankly built on a lot of new misery?
What's fascinating here is that Peter Gay explicitly acknowledges this dark underbelly. And more importantly, so did the philosophers themselves.
Okay, so they weren't just ignoring it.
No, they weren't blind. Misery followed economic improvement like a shadow. People still died of starvation. The rural and urban masses had very little share in the new economic dispensation.
So progress had a massive human cost.
As Gay writes, progress often called for new victims. However, what changed fundamentally was not the immediate eradication of poverty, but the mindset of the articulate classes toward that poverty.
Wait, so they didn't actually fix the slums, they just changed how they thought about them.
Yes, but that cognitive shift is everything.
How so?
Previously, misery, poverty, and disease were viewed as divine decrees. If there was a plague or a famine, it was a punishment from God.
Or just, an inescapable feature of a fallen, sinful world.
Right. The only acceptable response was pious resignation and maybe some charity. But with the recovery of nerve, the articulate classes, the scientists, the merchants, the philosophers, they stopped viewing mass misery as a theological necessity.
Oh, I see.
Started viewing it as a technical problem.
Wow. Okay, so if poverty isn't a curse from God, then it's just a structural inefficiency in how we've set up our economy.
Precisely the leap they made. They believed that because they were successfully curing the physical body through medicine, they could eventually cure the social body through social science.
That completely moves the burden of human suffering, doesn't it?
Completely. It moves it from God's mysterious plan directly onto human shoulders.
Which is incredibly empowering, but also, terrifyingly heavy.
Absolutely. You can't blame Fortuna anymore?
Right. If people are starving, it's because your social blueprint is flawed. So once you realize suffering is a structural inefficiency, who gets to draw up the new blueprints?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah. How did these thinkers turn a general feeling of optimism into a concrete historical program?
That leads us directly to the rise of what was famously called the Republic of Letters.
The Republic of Letters.
Yeah. To build a new blueprint for society, you need an independent class of architects. And for the very first time in European history, writers and intellectuals achieved real independence.
Right, because for centuries, writers were basically intellectual servants.
They were.
They were entirely reliant on patronage from wealthy aristocrats or the church. And, if the king or the bishop is paying your rent, you are only going to write things that the king or the bishop approves of.
Exactly. You couldn't rock the boat.
But in the 18th century, thanks to a massive rise in literacy, the proliferation of the printing press, and a growing middle class with disposable income, a writer could actually make a living.
They could sell their books directly.
Right, selling essays directly to the public.
And that economic independence was the lifeblood of the Enlightenment. It provided the philosophers with a secure, autonomous base of operations.
They didn't need to beg for permission to think.
No. They weren't just isolated philosophers dreaming in their studies. They became a genuine community, a family, as Gay frequently calls them.
A family of intellectuals.
Right. They communicated constantly across national borders, from Edinburgh to Paris to Naples, sharing ideas, debating fiercely, and collectively influencing public opinion.
They were really a united front.
They were the united architects of what Gay terms the Great Reorientation.
The Great Reorientation. I just love that phrasing. It perfectly captures the shift from looking backward to looking forward.
It does.
Like we discussed earlier, European culture had always looked to the past for its ideals, either to the classical antiquity of the Greeks and Romans or to the theological purity of the early church.
Right, looking backward for perfection.
The prevailing assumption was that the pinnacle of human achievement was in the rearview mirror, but The Republic of Letters flipped that entirely.
They oriented the European mind toward the future. But to do this effectively, to get people to actually care about building a better world for tomorrow, they had to confront a massive psychological roadblock,
Which was
the Christian concept of the afterlife.
Oh, yeah.
Think about it. If this world is just a temporary sinful waiting room for eternal life in heaven,
Yeah.
why bother trying to perfect society here?
Exactly. Why polish the brass on a sinking ship?
Right. Dennis Diderot steps in here, and his solution, I mean, it's just brilliant.
Yeah, his idea blew my mind. Diderot, one of the most prominent and radical of the French philosophers, offers this brilliant secularization of heaven.
He really does.
He proposes the concept of posterity. For Diderot, the hope of being remembered, respected, and admired by future generations of humanity replaced the Christian promise of eternal life.
It is a stunning conceptual pivot. Diderot essentially invented a secular immortality.
Wait, so he's basically saying, don't be a good person because you want to play a harp on a cloud forever. Be a good person, write a great book, build a just law, because 100 years from now, people you will never meet will read your name and thank you for making their lives better.
That's it, exactly.
That changes the entire motivation for human virtue.
But he admitted this was essentially a myth, didn't he?
He did. He acknowledged that posterity might be an illusion. After all, you will be dead.
Right. You won't actually be around to enjoy the praise of future generations.
Exactly. But he argued it was a socially vital, scientifically useful myth. It was the ultimate motivator for artists, writers, and statesmen to perform virtuous, lasting actions.
It gives them a reason to build.
Yes. To hope for the respect of posterity was to dedicate your life to the continuous, practical improvement of the human race.
And no one captured this total obsession with the future quite like the Marquis de Condorcet.
Oh, absolutely. Condorcet is the ultimate example. The source material spends a lot of time on his most famous work, the esquisse, his sketch, for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind.
It's basically a grand theory of everything regarding human history.
Right. He divided all of human history into 10 epochs. 9 of them were in the past and present, detailing the grueling struggles, the errors, and the slow triumphs of human reason.
But the 10th epoch.
The 10th epoch was his pure vision of the future.
Condorcet's esquisse is a masterpiece of Enlightenment optimism. But what makes it truly brilliant is that he introduces a dialectical view of history.
A dialectical view. What does that mean in this context?
He leans heavily into the law of unintended consequences. He argued that history isn't just a straight line of smart people doing smart things.
It's much messier than that.
Much messier. It is often driven by forces that produce the exact opposite of their intended, often nefarious goals.
Give me an example of that, because the one in the text is just the ultimate historical irony.
The most striking example Condorcet offers is his view on the medieval church. Now, he despised the tyranny of the priesthood.
He wasn't a fan.
Not at all. But he pointed out that priests, in their desperate quest to maintain power and spread religious dogma, inadvertently accelerated the progress of enlightenment.
How did they do that?
Well, to maintain their monopoly on truth, they had to preserve ancient texts, build libraries, and establish a class of educated scholars.
And it goes even deeper than just preserving books. He argues that the scholastics of the Middle Ages, these hyper-intense theologians who would spend decades obsessing over incredibly subtle, arcane religious distinctions.
Like the exact nature of the Trinity.
Yeah, or like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin that they accidentally birth the tools of modern science.
Exactly right. Their need to constantly subdivide ideas to create these rigorous logical frameworks just to win obscure theological debates. It created the very analytical mindset that the scientific revolution would later use.
That is just incredible.
The scientific revolution took that razor-sharp analytical tool, stripped away the theology, and pointed it at physics.
I love that. The church accidentally forging the very intellectual weapon that the Enlightenment would use to dismantle the church's authority.
It's a huge irony.
It really is. But let me ask you this, because there's a tension here that I want to explore. If these thinkers were so utterly obsessed with the future and so fiercely confident in modern scientific progress, how did they view their beloved ancient Greeks and Romans?
That's a great question.
Because in Volume 1, the philosophers used antiquity as their heroes. Did they just discard them now that they had telescopes and steam engines?
That tension is the beautiful paradox of what Peter Gay calls the modern pagan.
The modern pagan.
Yes. The philosophes initially used the ancients, the pagan philosophers of Greece and Rome, like Cicero or Lucretius, as a wedge to break free from the intellectual monopoly of the Christian church.
Right, because antiquity gave them a working model of a secular, rational society that had achieved greatness without the Bible.
Exactly. But once they had successfully broken the church's hold on the European mind, they used modern science to break free from the ancients.
Ah, so the Greeks and Romans were a stepping stone. They weren't the final destination.
Precisely. They revered the ancient spirit of inquiry, but they ruthlessly discarded their outdated physics.
That makes sense.
Voltaire famously declared that a simple modern mechanic who only knows recent empirical experiments is a vastly better physicist than Descartes or the ancient Greek genius Democritus.
Because the mechanic actually has facts.
Right. The mechanic might not be as great a man in terms of historical stature, but he knows more objectively true things about the physical world.
However, and this feels like a really crucial point to make, so we don't paint them as naive, their program for progress wasn't just blind guaranteed optimism, was it?
Not at all. It's vital to understand the context in which Condorcet wrote his incredibly optimistic 10th epoch.
All right, the circumstances are crazy.
In this epoch, he boldly predicts the eventual end of slavery, the full equality of women, and the global triumph of reason over superstition. But he wrote this while he was literally in hiding during the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution.
Fleeing for his life from the radical Jacobins.
Yes, he eventually died in a prison cell shortly after finishing it.
He is writing the most hopeful document in human history while his own society is collapsing into blood and terror outside his window.
Which proves that for the philosophes, progress was not an automatic, inevitable guarantee. They knew the world was still full of hypocrisy, violence, and terror.
It wasn't just going to happen on its own.
Progress was a moral duty. It was something that required constant, vigilant, and often dangerous effort.
Which brings us perfectly to the next major pillar of their thought. If progress is a duty, and the goal is to systematically build a better future, what is the ultimate tool you use to build it?
And for the philosophes, that tool was the scientific method.
Right. Specifically championed by their ultimate undisputed hero, Isaac Newton.
Newton was essentially deified by the Enlightenment. They needed a hero, a patron saint, to represent their new worldview, and Newton was perfect.
Why him, specifically?
Voltaire argued passionately that true greatness doesn't belong to politicians, kings, and conquerors who rule humanity through violence and enslavement. True greatness belongs to a man like Newton, who understands the universe through truth.
Because Newton's physics offered a universe of staggering order.
Yes, governed by discoverable mathematical laws.
And this leads to a massive cultural shift toward positivism, which is the strict separation of facts from values.
A very important distinction.
Before Newton, people constantly tried to find moral or theological meaning in natural events. Like, if a storm destroyed a village, it was God's wrath for their sins.
Or if a comet appeared in the sky, it was a dark omen.
Exactly. But science strips away all those theological and aesthetic explanations. As the text notes, gravity is neither kind nor cruel. It just is.
The scientific method Newton championed demanded that researchers first collect phenomena, rigorously observe their effects, and discover their mutual dependence before formulating any grand theories.
Look at the evidence first.
Right. It was an incredibly potent, objective instrument. It cleared away centuries of superstitious cobwebs. And here is the critical, revolutionary leap the Enlightenment made.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
They decided to take Newton's method, which works so brilliantly for calculating planetary orbits and the refraction of light, and apply it to human nature.
Yes. David Hume's Science of Man. This is where the blueprint really starts to take shape.
Hume argued forcefully that if the scientific method is the sole reliable way to gain knowledge about the physical world, it is absurd to use different mystical methods to study ourselves.
We have to study ourselves scientifically.
The scientific method must be exported to the study of humanity. Psychology, sociology, ethics, and politics could all be studied with the same rigorous empirical observation as physics.
Just observing human behavior in society, in commerce, in the pursuit of pleasure.
Right. They believed they could establish a science of man that would be vastly superior in its practical utility to any other science.
But to do that, to apply physics to psychology, they had to completely redefine what a human being actually is.
Because the old definition was very bleak.
Very bleak. For centuries, Christian theology taught that human nature was fundamentally fallen, burdened by original sin from the Garden of Eden. We were inherently corrupt, prone to evil, and desperately in need of divine salvation.
A very pessimistic view.
But the Enlightenment looks at human nature and rehabilitates it. They declared it to be neutral or even inherently good. And a massive part of this was the rehabilitation of the passions.
This is perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Enlightenment psychology. Traditional Christian morality viewed the passions, our desires, our bodily urges, our intense emotions, our ambitions, as inherently dangerous.
They were the vectors of sin.
Exactly. They were things that had to be constantly suppressed and mortified. But philosophers like Diderot, Voltaire, and the Marquis de Vauvenargues completely inverted this.
What did they argue?
They argued that the passions are actually the engines of human greatness.
Hmm?
Vauvenargues famously wrote, "The great thoughts come from the heart."
I think about this shift like looking at a massive, complex building.
Okay, let's hear it.
For centuries, theologians pointed at the foundational materials, human desires, ambitions, passions, and said, these materials are cursed. This building is condemned. It's always going to collapse into sin. You just have to pray it holds up until you get to heaven.
A condemned site.
Right. But the philosophers walk onto the construction site, they inspect the materials, and they say, no, these materials are actually incredibly strong. This ambition, this desire, this is exactly what we need to build a soaring, magnificent civilization.
The materials aren't the problem.
Exactly. The materials aren't cursed. We've just had terrible architects. We just need to use reason to design a better structure.
That architectural metaphor perfectly captures the political implications of this psychological shift. Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, by removing the doctrine of original sin, the philosophers completely shifted the blame for human misery.
How so?
If man is not inherently corrupt by divine decree, then the evils of the world, tyranny, crushing poverty, cruelty, injustice, they are not inevitable punishments from God that we must suffer.
They are structural errors in how society has been engineered.
Precisely. So it completely moves the responsibility for human happiness from hoping for divine grace in the next world to demanding human engineering and social science in this world.
Which makes sense.
They also systematically reevaluated specific passions that had been classified for centuries as deadly sins, namely pride and lust.
Okay, how do you rehabilitate pride and lust? Because those are the big ones.
Stripped of their sinful status, they analyzed them functionally. Pride, when guided by reason, was no longer a fatal arrogance against God.
What was it then?
It was seen as the sober self-confidence that spurs men to achieve great things, to build businesses, to create masterpieces of art.
Oh, I see. Ambition.
Right. And lust, or human sexuality, when guided by mutual affection and reason rather than suppressed by religious guilt, was recognized as a natural, healthy, and vital component of human existence.
It's just a part of life.
They sought what Gay calls a passionate naturalism. They knew that form without freedom was dead, but they also knew that freedom without form was brutish.
So reason is the form.
Exactly. Reason wasn't supposed to kill the passions. Reason was supposed to build the aqueducts that guided the river of passion toward productive ends.
Okay, so let's follow this logic. If you decide that you are going to scientifically engineer society and you fully embrace human passion as a positive force, how does that change the actual lived culture?
It ripples through everything.
Right. How does it change the art people make or how they write history or how they understand different countries?
It changes everything, and it actually births entirely new disciplines. Let's start with art, because the struggle in aesthetics perfectly reflects the broader intellectual struggle of the age.
Because there were a lot of competing styles at the time.
The 18th century was awash in them. You had the heavy grandeur of the Baroque, the playful ornamentation of the Rococo, the beginnings of early Romanticism, and the strict rules of neoclassicism.
A very crowded field.
It was. The challenge for Enlightenment thinkers was finding objective rules for beauty in an age that was increasingly recognizing cultural relativism.
And Immanuel Kant steps in here and provides a massive breakthrough, right?
Who does?
But before Kant, how was art viewed? Like, why did it need a breakthrough?
For a long time, art was heavily burdened by external requirements. It was either judged by how well it served the utilitarian purposes of the state or how effectively it delivered moral and religious instruction to the masses.
So it was propaganda or a sermon?
Essentially, yes. A painting was good if it made you a better Christian or a more loyal subject. Kant emancipated art from this burden.
How did he do it? What was his actual argument?
Kant argued in his Aesthetics that art is a completely unique, autonomous sphere of human activity. It is not merely physical labor, and it is not merely moral instruction.
What is it?
He defined art as originality channeled by craftsmanship. It is passion guided by reason. Most importantly, Kant built a philosophical firewall around art, separating it entirely from utilitarian purposes or religious moralizing.
So art doesn't have to be a tool.
Right. He argued that beauty has its own independent logic and dignity.
Set art free. As the French writer Mercier exclaimed, he gave art permission to just be beautiful, just as scientists were freeing physics from having to agree with theology.
Exactly the same principle.
And while art is being emancipated, a brand new field of science is being invented to advance human freedom: sociology.
This is one of the most exciting developments of the era. The Philosophes were avid, voracious readers of travel literature.
Because exploration was booming.
Right. Explorers, merchants, and missionaries were constantly returning to Europe with highly detailed accounts of cultures in the Americas, in Africa, and in Asia.
And these accounts described societies that operated with completely different morals.
Different morals, different sexual norms, and different political structures than Europe. Yet they were functioning, organized societies.
I can only imagine how that completely broke the European brain.
Oh, it caused a massive crisis.
If you've been told your whole life that the Christian European way is the absolute only way a society can survive because it's ordained by God, and then someone hands you a book showing a massive, thriving civilization in China that has never even heard of your God, there's a massive shock to the system.
It was a profound shock. But the philosopher Montesquieu used this travel literature brilliantly in his writings.
What do you do with it?
He realized that the world was incredibly vast and that human customs were wildly diverse. It moved him to observe that the true is not always probable.
The true is not always probable.
Right. He showed that techniques, laws, or customs that deeply shock Western sensibilities might be contrary to local European habits, but they are not necessarily contrary to human nature.
And this birth of sociology, this study of how societies actually function rather than how the Bible says they should function, was deeply tied to the birth of political economy.
Yes, the study of wealth itself. Thinkers like Adam Smith in Scotland and Adam Ferguson began rigorously studying the division of labor and the actual origins of national wealth.
They aggressively moved economic thought away from mercantilism.
I did.
Let's explain mercantilism, because that was a dominant economic operating system of the time.
Mercantilism viewed global wealth as a fixed, finite pie. It viewed international trade essentially as a weapon of state power.
So it was a zero-sum game.
Exactly. The goal was to hoard as much gold and silver as possible, meaning one nation's economic gain was necessarily another nation's loss. It was an economics of warfare and jealousy.
But Adam Smith saw it differently.
Adam Smith and his contemporaries envisioned a dynamic, expanding world economy. They argued that through free trade and the division of labor, the prosperity of one nation could actually fuel the prosperity of all.
Wealth could be created, not just stolen.
Exactly.
And history itself gets a massive reboot. Edward Gibbon writes his massive multi-volume Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and he does something unprecedented.
He removes God from the narrative.
Right. He analyzes the rise and triumph of Christianity not as a miraculous, inevitable divine plan, but through purely human causes. The Philosophes basically invented cultural history.
They stopped just listing the dates that kings died and battles were fought.
And they started looking at how economics, religion, climate, and geography all interacted to shape the destiny of a society.
By expelling God as the active, day-to-day manager of historical events, they opened up history to secular, scientific analysis. They made it possible to study human development objectively, to look for actual causes and effects in the historical record.
But wait, I have a major question here, and it connects back to Montesquieu and all that travel literature.
Okay, what is it?
If these thinkers are reading all these accounts of vastly different cultures, and they're writing secular histories showing that morals change over time, doesn't that completely destroy the idea that there is any objective right way to live?
The relativism problem.
Yeah. How did they deal with the terror of absolute cultural relativism? If everything's just a local custom, how can you say freedom is better than tyranny?
That is a very sharp observation, and it highlights a major tension of the Enlightenment. This creeping cultural relativism was indeed terrifying to traditionalists and the church.
Because it suggested their rules were just arbitrary.
Exactly. Precisely because it suggested that Christian European morals were just local, arbitrary customs, not universal divine laws. But it was incredibly liberating to the philosophers. However, you are right to ask how they grounded their own values.
Because they weren't nihilists.
No, they were not pure, anything-goes relativists.
So how did they build a foundation if everything is relative?
They grounded it in the science of man. Thinkers like David Hume and Montesquieu argued that while cultural expressions, things like clothing, marriage customs, specific religious rituals, or diet differ wildly across the globe, the underlying human nature beneath those customs is uniform.
Ah. The foundational materials are the same everywhere, even if the buildings look different.
Exactly. And because human nature has consistent, observable psychological and physical needs, certain political and social systems are objectively better for human flourishing than others.
Can you give an example?
For example, a gentle, free government that allows for personal autonomy, free inquiry, and economic mobility is objectively better suited to human nature than a despotic tyranny that rules through fear and arbitrary violence.
Regardless of the local culture.
Regardless of the local culture or climate. Science, by understanding the universal baseline of human nature, actually creates and preserves values. It doesn't destroy them. It puts them on a firmer foundation than ancient myths.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. It provides a scientific baseline for morality. So, if we look at the blueprint so far, it all sounds amazing on paper.
Very rational.
You have a confident mindset, you have secular writers mapping out the future, you embrace human passion, and you design a free scientific society tailored to universal human nature.
Perfect plan.
But when we look at the actual politics of the era, we hit a massive, terrifying roadblock. The philosophers look out the windows of their salons and they encounter the actual living public.
Yes, and this is where the pristine theories of the Enlightenment collide violently with the grim realities of the 18th century.
Because the public wasn't exactly a bunch of philosophers.
Not at all. The political goals of the Enlightenment were, in theory, incredibly decent and humane. They wanted a society open to talent, where reason, ability, and merit mattered more than aristocratic bloodlines.
They campaigned fiercely for humane laws.
You had figures like Cesar Beccaria writing brilliantly against the barbarity of judicial torture and the death penalty, arguing that punishments should be rational deterrence, not cruel vengeance.
They also completely shifted the justification for why a government should even exist. They moved away from abstract concepts like natural law or divine right of kings and toward utilitarianism, which was heavily championed by Jeremy Bentham.
The greatest happiness principle?
Right. The idea there is simple but radical.
Right.
The ultimate test of any government, any law, or any institution is whether it promotes the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people in this life.
But here is the central, agonizing dilemma of the Enlightenment. The philosophers desperately wanted a free, rational, self-governing society. But the masses of people in the 18th century, the peasants in the fields, the laborers in the cities, were entirely uneducated, largely illiterate, and deeply, deeply entrenched in what the philosophers saw as fanatical religious superstition.
The social distance between the intellectual elite in the Republic of Letters and the rural or urban poor was a vast, unbridgeable abyss.
It was a massive gulf.
And honestly, the quotes from our source material regarding how these brilliant, supposedly progressive philosophers viewed the common people are stark. They are often shocking to modern ears.
They are deeply jarring. They reveal a profound, almost paralyzing pessimism that haunted the Enlightenment project.
Let me just read a few to give you, listening, a sense of this. John Locke, who's considered the great father of modern liberalism, suggested that if you're going to educate the poor, you should only teach them working-class skills so they'll be compliant, useful laborers.
Just enough to work, not enough to think.
Right. And Rousseau, who is often hailed as the great champion of democracy and the general will, flatly stated in his writings on education, the poor have no need of education.
It's so dismissive.
Immanuel Kant, the guy who just emancipated art, casually called the general public idiots. And Diderot, our guy who invented secular immortality, wrote that the canaille, which translates to the mob or the rabble, is always the same. Imbecilic, miserable, and far too busy trying to survive to ever enlighten itself.
Those quotes highlight a massive crisis of faith in their own project. It sparked an intense, ongoing debate among the philosophes over the concept of the social religion.
The social religion.
Because the masses were so irrational and prone to violence, many philosophers, even though they themselves were secular deists or outright atheists who scoffed at theology, they seriously debated whether the uneducated masses needed the fear of an angry god.
Like they needed the threat of eternal hellfire just to keep them from rioting, looting, and murdering each other.
Exactly. Even if it was a lie, they wondered if it was a necessary lie for the poor.
So what does this all mean? Weren't these supposed champions of equality, reason, and freedom actually just incredibly snobbish elitists?
That's a very fair question.
Did they just want to tear down the old aristocracy of blood and religion, only to replace it with a new aristocracy of the intellect, keeping all the actual political power for themselves and their rich friends?
You're hitting on the core paradox of Enlightenment politics. It's a very valid critique. And Peter Gay explicitly calls their attitude a snobbish liberalism.
Snobbish liberalism, that fits perfectly.
Their immediate, visceral reactions to the unwashed, uneducated masses were undeniably elitist and fearful. But we must look beyond their personal prejudices and examine their structural solutions.
Because the structure matters more than their personal feelings.
The profound thing about the Enlightenment is that their ultimate structural solution to this terrible dilemma was inherently democratic.
Wait, how can you call the general public idiots, but still build a democratic solution? That seems contradictory.
Because they recognized that the only way to bridge the gap between an uneducated mob and a truly free, stable society is education.
They had to fix the root problem.
You cannot have a functioning democracy with an irrational, superstitious electorate. It will immediately collapse into anarchy or elect a tyrant. Rousseau, despite his pessimism about the immediate state of the poor, wrote his masterpiece, The Social Contract, precisely to design a theoretical system that safeguards the individual and promotes the general will.
So they didn't just give up.
No. The uncompromising logic of the Enlightenment dictated that if men are not yet ready for autonomy, they must be made ready for it.
I see. It's like they realize they have designed this incredibly powerful, incredibly fast sports car. And that sports car is modern, free, democratic society.
I like where this is going.
But they look out at the public and they realize absolutely no one knows how to drive. If they just hand the keys over to an illiterate, superstitious public, the car is going to crash immediately into mob rule.
Yes, exactly. And the crucial distinction is that their solution wasn't to say, therefore, because they can't drive, only we wealthy philosophers will drive the car forever and the masses can walk.
Right.
Their structural solution was, we must build driving schools.
Build driving schools.
They believed that universal education, slow and agonizing as it might be, would eventually elevate the masses so that they could responsibly wield the keys to their own freedom. That is why they all saw themselves primarily as educators.
Whether it was Diderot spending decades compiling the massive encyclopedia to democratize knowledge,
Or Lessing writing plays to teach religious tolerance. They were desperately trying to teach the world how to drive.
but teaching an entire continent how to drive takes generations. Did they ever get to see their sports car actually hit the road?
They did, actually.
Did these aging philosophers get to see their blueprint for a free, scientific society put into practice before they died? That brings us to the culmination of our deep dive, the American finale, the program in practice.
They had theorized about this new world for decades, constantly battling government censorship, the threat of prison, and deeply entrenched monarchies in Europe.
It was a theoretical battleground.
But across the Atlantic Ocean, in the British colonies of North America, an event occurred that roused the greatest, most fervent hopes among the aging philosophic family, the American Revolution.
It must have been completely surreal for them. You have these aging French and British philosophers watching this unfold, and they saw America as the ultimate validation of their entire life's work.
It was absolute proof.
Proof that self-improvement, rational government, and a society based on natural rights weren't just utopian pipe dreams cooked up in a Parisian salon. They were actually possible in the real world.
Diderot, in particular, was practically frenzied with excitement.
Really? Diderot?
Oh, yes. He wrote this highly emotional, almost romantic vision of these rustic, virtuous American philosophes fighting off the decadent, corrupted British military forces. He viewed America as a pristine sanctuary for freedom.
That's a very romantic view.
But ever the realist, he also issued a very stern warning to the Americans. He begged them to guard their newfound liberty against the corrupting influences of luxury, extreme wealth inequality, and the creeping European decadence that had ruined the Old World.
And the absolute darling of the European Enlightenment, the man who embodied this transatlantic bridge, was Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, they adored him.
The Europeans completely deified him. He was seen as the ultimate practical philosopher. He wasn't just a guy writing essays. He was an experimental scientist. He literally tamed lightning from the sky with his kite experiment. And then he went and tamed tyrants by helping to draft the Declaration of Independence.
He was the science of man personified. There is a famous, highly theatrical, almost religious meeting in Paris between the dying Voltaire, the grand patriarch of the Enlightenment, and Benjamin Franklin.
Oh, I've heard of this. It's legendary.
They meet at the Academy of Sciences. The crowd demands they embrace. Voltaire hugs Franklin, and then Voltaire lays his hands on Franklin's grandson and blesses him with just 2 words in English, God and liberty.
God and liberty. That is incredible. It was a literal symbolic passing of the torch. The old world European Enlightenment bestowing its blessing onto the new world American experiment.
And the Americans felt it.
The founding generation were highly conscious of their role in this philosophical drama. George Washington, in his 1783 circular letter to the states after the war, explicitly stated that the American empire was not founded in some gloomy age of ignorance and superstition.
He was very clear about that.
He proudly declared it was founded in an epoch of philosophical research, utilizing the treasures of knowledge acquired by philosophers and sages to build a rational government.
Washington was overtly acknowledging that they were building the house using the Enlightenment's blueprints.
I just marvel at this. It really is like watching a brilliant sci-fi author write about faster-than-light spaceships for 50 years, being mocked by everyone, and then actually living long enough to see a team of engineers build one and launch it into orbit.
It's the perfect metaphor.
But I have to ask, did they think America was perfect? Did the philosophers or the American founders themselves view the United States as a finished, flawless utopia?
No, and that is perhaps the most vital point to understand about the entire Enlightenment project. Their mindset was inherently empirical and experimental, not utopian.
Because utopias are closed systems.
Right. Utopias are finished and perfect. Science is always ongoing. Look at James Madison's Federalist Number 14, which Peter Gay actually quotes in the preface of his book to set the tone.
What does Madison say?
Madison praises the American spirit not because they created a perfect society right out of the gate, but because they did not suffer from a blind veneration for antiquity, for custom, or for names.
Right, they weren't trapped by the past. They weren't looking backward.
Precisely. Madison says the Americans relied on their own good sense, their knowledge of human nature, and their own experience to innovate in favor of private rights and public happiness.
So it was an ongoing process.
The American experiment was viewed as exactly that, an experiment. It was a massive, ongoing scientific project in human freedom. It was subject to revision, to improvement, and required the constant, vigilant application of reason.
It wasn't the end of history where everything is solved.
No, it was the very beginning of modern history.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and pull all of these massive historical threads together. Over the course of this deep dive into Peter Gay's The Science of Freedom, we have explored a profound intellectual tectonic shift that created the modern world.
A huge journey.
We saw how a recovery of nerve, fueled by very real medical victories over death and technological breakthroughs over nature, allowed 18th century thinkers to stop cowering before the whims of Fortuna and start actively designing their own future.
They took control.
We saw how they took Newton's rigorous objective scientific method and pointed it inward, directly at human nature itself. By stripping away the paralyzing theological burden of original sin, they rehabilitated human passion, turning it from a condemned curse into the very foundational material of human progress.
We examine how this new, empirical, future-oriented mindset birthed entirely new fields of study sociology, political economy, and cultural history, while simultaneously freeing art to be judged on its own independent aesthetic merits.
It reshaped everything.
And crucially, we confronted the harsh, terrifying political reality they faced. The massive dilemma of trying to build a free, rational society with a public that was largely uneducated and steeped in ancient superstitions.
They realized, sometimes reluctantly, that you can't just decree freedom from on high. You have to cultivate it from the ground up. They concluded that universal education, relentless scientific critique, and practical political experiments, like the messy, ongoing American Revolution, were the only tools available to slowly, laboriously drag humanity toward decency and autonomy.
It was a monumental program built on the unshakable conviction that knowledge is power, and that mankind, though flawed and often irrational, ultimately holds the tools for its own salvation.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. Today, in our modern world, we possess more data, more rigorous science, and infinitely more technological power than Voltaire, Diderot, or Condorcet could have ever dreamed of in their wildest, most optimistic fantasies.
It's true. They would be astounded by our tools.
We have mapped the human genome, we have split the atom, we carry supercomputers in our pockets. Yet culturally, if you look around, we often feel completely paralyzed.
There's a lot of pessimism today.
We're gripped by widespread cynicism, by eco-anxiety, by toxic political division, and a pervasive, sinking feeling that the future is merely something to be survived rather than something to be built.
It's a reversal of their mindset.
Have we, in the 21st century, suffered a modern loss of nerve? If those 18th century thinkers could look at our world today, with all our incredible godlike tools and all our pervasive despair, would they tell us that our problem isn't a lack of science, but a lack of the courage to use it? Do we perhaps need to spark a third enlightenment?